The photograph doesn't lie, but it doesn't tell the truth either. Summer, 1943. Two generals stand side by side in a Sicilian courtyard, sunlight harsh on their faces, cameras clicking, victory declared. The island has fallen. The Axis is reeling. History will record this as a triumph of Allied cooperation, a textbook example of combined arms warfare, a stepping stone to the liberation of Europe. But look closer at their eyes. Notice the forced smiles. The way they angle their bodies, not toward each other but toward the cameras, toward posterity, toward the audiences back home who will read tomorrow's newspapers and believe in unity. Between them lies something unspoken, something that will never make the newsreels. A contempt so profound it nearly destroyed the alliance from within. While their soldiers bled together on Sicilian hillsides, their commanders waged a different war entirely. One fought with press releases and territorial boundaries, with pride and precedent, with everything except bullets. This is the story of how victory became a poison. How the conquest of Sicily, a campaign that should have united the Allies in common purpose, instead revealed the fault lines that would haunt the coalition for the rest of the war. How men who shared an enemy somehow became each other's adversaries. And how an island in the Mediterranean became the stage for a betrayal that was never officially acknowledged, never formally apologized for, but never forgotten. The cameras captured triumph. But they missed the truth. Sometimes the hardest battle isn't against the enemy in front of you. It's against the ally beside you. Sicily doesn't surrender easily. It never has. The island hangs like a football kicked off the toe of Italy's boot, a triangular fortress of mountains and coastline that has been invaded, occupied, and conquered by every empire that ever mattered. Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Normans, Spanish, all of them came for Sicily's harbors, its grain fields, its strategic position at the crossroads of the Mediterranean. All of them discovered that taking the island and holding it are entirely different propositions. By 1943, Sicily had endured 3 years of war, caught between Mussolini's collapsing dreams and Hitler's desperate strategy to defend Europe's southern flank. The island's towns, Palermo, Messina, Catania, Syracuse, bore the scars of Allied bombing campaigns. Its farmers watched the skies and learned to read the difference between British bombers and American ones by the sound of their engines. Its fishermen pulled bodies from the sea alongside their nets. The terrain itself seemed designed to frustrate invaders. The interior rises sharply into mountains, rough, volcanic peaks that channel movement into predictable valleys and coastal roads. Mount Etna dominates the eastern landscape, its summit often hidden in clouds, its slopes covered in black lava fields where tanks bog down and infantry advances become killing grounds. The soil is either dust or mud depending on the season, and in July 1943, it was dust, choking, blinding, turning every movement into an announcement of position. The coastline alternates between sheer cliffs and narrow beaches, offering few ideal landing sites. The beaches that did exist were easily defended, overlooked by high ground where a single machine gun could command entire sectors. The Axis had been fortifying these positions for months, turning promising invasion beaches into potential graveyards. But Sicily was also exhausted. The civilian population had grown weary of being Europe's strategic football. Food was scarce. Allied bombing had destroyed infrastructure faster than anyone could repair it. In towns like Palermo, people whispered that perhaps the Allies would be better than the Germans or at least no worse. The mafia, temporarily suppressed under Mussolini's thuggish efficiency, began to stir again, calculating how to position themselves for whatever came next. For the Allies, Sicily wasn't just another island to conquer. It was the gateway to Europe, the first major step onto Hitler's continental fortress. Taking Sicily would secure Mediterranean shipping lanes, knock Italy out of the war, force Germany to divert resources southward, and provide air bases within striking distance of occupied Europe. Churchill called it the soft underbelly of the Axis, though anyone who'd studied the terrain knew there was nothing soft about it. More importantly, Sicily was where the alliance would prove itself. After years of fighting on separate fronts, the British holding on desperately, the Americans building their strength, this would be their first truly combined operation. A test not just of military capability, but of whether nations with different histories, different military traditions, and very different ideas about how to win a war could actually fight together. The island waited. Unknowing, uncaring. Just another set of conquerors approaching across the same ancient waters. Another chapter in its long history of violence. But this time would be different. This time, the invaders would wound each other almost as badly as they wounded the enemy. The conference room in Algiers was stifling even with the windows open. May 1943 and North Africa was already sliding into summer heat. Around the table sat men who commanded millions, who could order cities burned or saved with a signature, who were reshaping the map of the world in real time. On paper they were united. The Allied command structure for Operation Husky looked impressive. General Dwight D. Eisenhower as Supreme Commander, British General Harold Alexander as his Deputy and Ground Forces Commander, British Admiral Andrew Cunningham commanding naval forces, British Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder controlling the air campaign. A combined staff. A shared objective. A coalition forged in the fires of North Africa's victories. But organizational charts conceal as much as they reveal. The plan that emerged from those Algiers meetings was a compromise, and like most compromises, it satisfied no one completely. Two armies would land simultaneously on Sicily's southern coast. British 8th Army under General Bernard Montgomery would take the eastern beaches near Syracuse, while American 7th Army under General George Patton would land to the west near Gela. Montgomery would drive north toward Messina, the key port city that controlled the narrow strait to mainland Italy. Patton's role was to protect Montgomery's flank. Read that again. Patton's role was to protect Montgomery's flank. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what that sentence meant to American pride. The United States had entered the war late, a fact the British never let them forget. American forces were still learning lessons the British had paid for in blood across 3 years of desert warfare. The British 8th Army was a battle-hardened machine that had defeated Rommel. The American forces were largely untested beyond their recent North African campaigns. So when the plan relegated Patton, already the most aggressive, glory-hungry general in the American Army, to a supporting role for Montgomery, already the most arrogant, publicity-conscious general in the British Army, it planted the seeds of the catastrophe to come. But in May 1943, everyone still believed in the alliance. Or at least pretended to. Eisenhower stood before maps of Sicily and spoke of unity. Of combined arms cooperation. Of the historic nature of this first step onto European soil. He was good at this, the Kansas farm boy who'd learned to navigate the egos of prima donnas, who could smooth over disagreements with a folksy anecdote and a strategic concession. He genuinely believed that personality could overcome institutional friction. Montgomery studied the maps with his characteristic intensity, already calculating victory. He saw the campaign in classical terms. A methodical advance, properly supplied, overwhelming force at decisive points, minimal casualties, certain success. He'd been fighting the Germans for years. He knew their patterns, their strengths, their weaknesses. Sicily would fall the same way North Africa had fallen, through patient, professional application of superior resources. Patton prowled the room like a caged animal, pearl-handled revolvers on his hips, speaking in profanities and poetry about aggressive warfare and bold maneuver. He saw Montgomery's caution as cowardice, his careful planning as timidity. Wars weren't won by being careful. They were won by audacity, by striking faster than the enemy could react, by gambling everything on speed and shock. Even then you could see it, two fundamentally different philosophies of war, embodied by two men who despised everything the other represented. The British view was that war was too serious to be left to the Americans' cowboys. You didn't risk soldiers' lives on romantic charges and reckless maneuvers. You planned carefully, you accumulated overwhelming force, you advanced methodically. You won through professionalism, not theatrics. The American view was that the British had been fighting for 3 years and still hadn't won. Maybe caution wasn't the virtue they claimed it was. Maybe what Europe needed wasn't another methodical advance but a knockout punch. Maybe the old empire was too tired to see that a new way of war was emerging. But these tensions remained polite in May 1943. Differences of opinion, nothing more. Professional disagreements between allies pursuing a common goal. The intelligence estimates predicted light resistance. The Italians were dispirited, the Germans stretched thin. Sicily would fall quickly, 2 weeks, maybe 3. A short campaign, a clear victory, a successful test of Allied cooperation before the real invasion of Europe. They had ships assembled from across 2 navies, nearly 3,000 vessels, the largest amphibious force in history to that point. They had aircraft from a dozen nations. They had detailed maps, weather predictions, naval bombardment plans, airborne assault schedules, supply tables, casualty estimates, contingency plans for every conceivable scenario. What they didn't have, what no plan could provide, was a cure for the poison of ego and nationalism that was already spreading through the alliance like invisible gas through a sealed room. The orders went out, July 10, 1943. Operation Husky would commence. On the maps it looked perfect. 2 arrows driving north, converging on Messina, Sicily falling like a ripe fruit into Allied hands. Reality, as always, had other ideas. The weather turned against them before a single soldier touched Sicilian soil. July 9, 1943, and the Mediterranean that was supposed to be calm and predictable erupted into a tempest. Winds gusting to 45 miles per hour. Waves reaching 12 feet. Nearly 3,000 ships trying to maintain formation in conditions that would challenge peacetime navigation, let alone the largest amphibious assault in human history. In the transport ships, soldiers vomited into helmets, onto decks, onto each other. The careful meal schedules, designed to ensure troops would land with energy, became irrelevant as men brought up everything they'd eaten. Some units would hit the beaches already exhausted, dehydrated, barely able to stand. The airborne assault, that cutting-edge tactic that was supposed to disrupt coastal defenses and seize key inland positions, became a masterclass in how technology and nature combined to create disaster. American paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne, jumping from C-47s buffeted by impossible winds, scattered across southeastern Sicily like seeds thrown from a careless hand. Units that were supposed to land together came down miles apart. Entire companies disappeared into the night. Men drowned in irrigation ditches, broke legs in stone walls they couldn't see, landed in enemy positions by accident and died before they could get their harnesses off. The British glider operation fared even worse. Gliders, fabric and wood coffins towed behind aircraft, released to glide silently to predetermined landing zones, had always been risky. In the storm they became death traps. Pilots couldn't see. Tow planes couldn't maintain altitude. Many released early, sending gliders into the Mediterranean miles from shore. Of 144 British gliders launched, 69 crashed into the sea. Men drowned still strapped into their seats, or fought their way out of sinking gliders only to be pulled under by their equipment. But somehow, through luck or stubborn courage or the sheer overwhelming weight of numbers, the beach landings succeeded. At 2:45 a.m. on July 10, the first waves hit Sicily's southern coast. Naval guns had been pounding the beaches for hours, turning defensive positions into cratered moonscapes. The Italian coastal divisions, undermanned, poorly equipped, thoroughly demoralized, put up scattered resistance and then collapsed. The Americans landed on 3 beaches west of Syracuse. At Gela they faced the stiffest resistance, Italian pillboxes firing into the landing craft, German tanks counterattacking at dawn, house to house fighting through streets that hadn't seen warfare since the Middle Ages. Rangers and infantry fought their way inland meter by meter, calling in naval gunfire that turned medieval churches into rubble. The British landings near Syracuse went smoother. Montgomery's careful planning paid dividends. Troops landed where they were supposed to land, supporting units arrived on schedule, casualties were lighter than predicted. By mid-morning, British forces were consolidating positions and preparing to push inland according to the timetable. And here, in the very success of those first hours, the seeds of future disaster took root. Because both commanders could already claim victory. Both could point to beaches secured, objectives taken, enemy forces retreating. Both could draft messages to their home countries announcing triumph. But they were reading different battles. Fighting different wars. Montgomery saw methodical success. His planning had worked. His army was ashore with acceptable losses, organized, ready to begin the systematic advance northward that would take Sicily in the calculated, professional manner that serious warfare demanded. Patton saw chaos barely contained, his paratroopers scattered, his beaches contested, his forces fighting desperate actions while the British sipped tea and secured Syracuse. He saw American blood paying for Allied victory while British caution avoided the hard fighting. Never mind that the plan had deliberately given Americans the tougher beaches. Never mind that Patton himself had accepted this arrangement. In the moment, bleeding on Sicilian sand, none of that mattered. And there was something else, something neither commander would admit in their official reports: the friendly fire. The night after the landings, American C-47s carrying paratroop reinforcements flew over the invasion fleet. Despite warnings, despite coordination, despite everyone knowing this flight was coming, nervous gunners on Allied ships opened fire. The sky filled with tracers. Planes exploded, fell burning into the sea. 23 aircraft destroyed, 410 American soldiers killed, by American and British ships firing in panic at their own aircraft. The official reports called it unfortunate. Called it regrettable. Called it an accident of war. The soldiers called it something else. Called it criminal incompetence. Called it evidence that the vaunted Allied coordination was a fiction maintained for newsreels and propaganda. And the commanders, Patton especially, stored away another grievance, another proof that the alliance was less than advertised. But the beaches were secured. Sicily was breached. The campaign was ahead of schedule. Everything was going according to plan. Except for the part where the Allies had started to hate each other. The maps told one story. The men who read them told another. Within 48 hours of landing, the command structure that looked so clean on paper began to fracture along fault lines that had always been there, just waiting for pressure. Montgomery's 8th Army pushed north from Syracuse with textbook precision. Each town secured. Each road cleared. Each bridge checked for demolitions. His supply lines stretched back to the beaches in perfect order. Ammunition forward, wounded back, every unit knowing its objective and its role. This was war as engineering project, as management challenge, as problem to be solved through superior organization. By July 13, Montgomery's forces had taken Augusta and were advancing on Catania, the gateway to Messina. The plan was working. Victory was inevitable. All it required was patience and proper execution. But Patton's 7th Army, assigned to protect Montgomery's flank, was boiling with frustration. Imagine being a soldier in Patton's command. You've just fought your way ashore through contested landings. You've taken casualties. You've proved yourself in combat. And now you're being told to wait. To hold position. To guard roads while the British get the glory of the advance to Messina. Patton couldn't stand it. Every fiber of his being, the cavalry officer who believed in mounted charges, the tank commander who'd pioneered armored warfare, the general who'd spent his entire career preparing for this moment, rebelled against being relegated to supporting role. On July 13, he made a decision that would define the campaign. Without consulting Montgomery. Without getting Alexander's approval. Without following the plan everyone had agreed to, Patton ordered his forces to drive west and north, not to support the British advance, but to capture Palermo, Sicily's capital, on the opposite side of the island. Read that again. The American commander unilaterally changed the entire operational plan in the middle of an active campaign. His justification was tactical creativity. The western part of Sicily was lightly defended. Palermo could be taken quickly. Capturing the capital would cut off enemy forces, secure ports for supplies, demonstrate American offensive capability. His actual motivation was impossible to miss. He was done playing second fiddle to Montgomery. When Alexander, the theater ground commander, learned what Patton had done, he faced an impossible choice. He could order Patton to reverse course, creating a public confrontation between Allied commanders in the middle of a campaign. Or he could retroactively approve Patton's unauthorized offensive, legitimizing insubordination and admitting he wasn't actually in command of his own forces. Alexander, ever the diplomat, chose the latter. Patton's drive on Palermo became official Allied strategy, after the fact. Montgomery was apoplectic. Not publicly, he was too calculating for public displays of emotion. But in his headquarters, in his diary, in his messages to London, he seethed. The Americans had broken formation. Had violated the plan. Had prioritized glory over operational coherence. And worst of all, they were succeeding. Because Patton's gamble was working. His forces raced across western Sicily against minimal resistance, covering in days what Montgomery's methodical advance would have taken weeks. On July 22, barely 12 days after landing, American forces entered Palermo to cheering crowds and international headlines. The newsreels back home loved it. Patton takes Palermo. American audiences saw their general, their army, winning victories while the British ground slowly forward through difficult terrain. Never mind that Montgomery was facing the actual German defensive positions. Never mind that Patton's drive, however spectacular, had done nothing to advance the strategic objective of taking Messina. The optics were clear. American audacity versus British caution. In London this was noted. In Washington this was celebrated. At Allied headquarters this was creating a crisis. Because now there were two competing campaigns in Sicily. Montgomery's methodical push toward Messina up the eastern coast, and Patton's improvisational drive that had netted territory and headlines but hadn't actually defeated the main enemy forces. The competition was no longer subtle. It was explicit, acknowledged, consuming. Montgomery publicly criticized American lack of discipline. Patton publicly mocked British timidity. Their staff stopped coordinating. Intelligence sharing became grudging and delayed. Each commander prioritized his own objectives over combined operations. Alexander, caught in the middle, made the situation worse by trying to satisfy both men. He gave Montgomery permission to continue his advance on Messina while simultaneously authorizing Patton to drive north along Sicily's northern coast, creating two parallel campaigns competing for the same objective. It was a race now. Not against the Germans. Against each other. The organizational chart still showed a unified command. But the reality was two separate armies fighting separate wars on the same island, nominally on the same side. Staff officers in both headquarters began to speak of the other army the way they spoke of the enemy. With suspicion. With resentment. With the conviction that their general was being undermined by allies who should have been supporting him. And the Germans, watching this unfold from their defensive positions around Etna, must have smiled grimly. The Allies were doing their work for them. By late July, Sicily had become a theater where three wars raged simultaneously. There was the war the newsreels showed, Allied forces advancing against Axis defenders, democracy marching forward, freedom approaching with inevitable certainty. There was the war the soldiers fought, brutal infantry combat in volcanic terrain, German rearguard actions that turned every village into a killing ground, heat and exhaustion and the grinding reality of combat against an enemy that refused to break. And there was the war the commanders waged, a contest of egos and national pride that threatened to tear apart the alliance from within. The race to Messina consumed both armies with intensity that bordered on madness. Montgomery's 8th Army, stalled in front of Catania by determined German resistance, tried to outflank the defenses with an amphibious landing up the coast. The landing succeeded tactically but failed strategically. German forces pulled back in good order, establishing new defensive lines further north. Each mile forward cost British lives and time, the very things Montgomery was trying to conserve. Patton, having captured Palermo, pivoted his entire army eastward and drove along Sicily's northern coast highway toward Messina. His forces moved faster than supply lines could keep up, faster than communication could coordinate, faster than caution would recommend. He didn't care. Speed was the objective. Beating Montgomery to Messina was the mission. Unit commanders on both sides received increasingly bizarre directives. British officers were told to accelerate advances regardless of casualties, from the same Montgomery who'd built his reputation on careful, casualty-conscious warfare. American commanders were ordered to take risks they'd normally never accept, from the same Patton who understood tactical realities. Both men were sacrificing their principles on the altar of competition. The madness reached its peak in early August. Both armies were converging on Messina from different directions. Montgomery from the south, Patton from the west, with the prize in sight and no willingness to yield. Patton ordered a series of amphibious end runs. Small landing forces dropped behind German lines to cut off their retreat. These operations were hasty, poorly coordinated, achieved little militarily. But they generated activity, created the appearance of aggressive maneuvering and most importantly made headlines. Montgomery, watching American forces getting attention while his army did the hard work of breaking German defenses, began to pressure his subordinates for faster advances. Troops who'd been trained in methodical warfare suddenly received orders that contradicted everything they'd been taught. Push harder. Move faster. Take risks. British and American units actually began to compete for roads. Not from the Germans, from each other. There were documented incidents of American military police blocking British convoys because this route is assigned to U.S. forces. Of British provists redirecting American vehicles because this road is 8th Army corridor. Allies were sabotaging each other's logistics. Intelligence officers stopped sharing information freely. If an American patrol discovered a gap in German defenses, that information might not reach British units who could exploit it, and vice versa. The institutional coordination that's essential to combined operations broke down completely. Soldiers noticed. They always do. In bars and captured towns, British and American troops who should have been celebrating together instead got into brawls. Not over women or alcohol, over whose army was really winning the campaign, whose general was better, whose nation's contribution mattered more. Military police reports from late July and early August document hundreds of incidents of Allied-on-Allied violence. Fights that started over perceived slights, your generals hiding behind ours, and escalated into unit-level brawls. The war correspondents noticed too. They filed stories about healthy competition and spirited rivalry between the Allied forces, missing, or deliberately ignoring, how unhealthy and how dangerous the situation had become. Because here's what the competition obscured. The Germans were escaping. While Patton and Montgomery raced each other, German forces under General Hans Valentin Hube conducted one of the war's most successful evacuations. Across the Strait of Messina to mainland Italy, under Allied air superiority, 40,000 German troops withdrew with most of their equipment intact. Tanks, artillery, vehicles, all ferried across 2 miles of water while the Allies congratulated themselves on conquering Sicily. The strategic objective, destroying German forces, not just capturing territory, was completely abandoned in favor of the tactical objective of being first into Messina. On August 16, Patton's forces entered Messina hours before Montgomery's army arrived. Patton stood in the city square, triumphant, while photographers captured the moment for history. He'd won the race. Sicily was conquered. Victory was declared. And it meant almost nothing because the enemy had escaped to fight another day. But that didn't matter to Patton. What mattered was the headline, "Americans take Messina." What mattered was that he'd beaten Montgomery to the objective. What mattered was that American prestige had been salvaged. When Montgomery's advance units arrived in Messina shortly after, they found American flags already flying. Found Patton already giving press conferences. Found their victory preempted by ours. The official Allied communiqué announced Sicily's capture as a great cooperative victory. Praised the coordination between forces. Celebrated the success of combined operations. It was all lies and everyone knew it. Stop for a moment. Consider what we've just witnessed. Two armies from nations that shared language, culture, democratic values, and a common enemy, nearly destroyed their alliance over an island they both conquered. Neither lost. Neither failed. Sicily fell exactly as predicted, perhaps faster than predicted. The Axis was expelled. The Mediterranean secured. The first step onto European soil accomplished. And yet something profound broke in Sicily. Something that never fully healed. Here's the question history doesn't answer. Who was right? Was Montgomery right to insist on methodical, coordinated warfare even if it meant slower advances and giving up glory to preserve alliance cohesion? Or was Patton right to seize initiative, demonstrate American capability, and refuse to accept a subordinate role even if it meant violating operational plans? Put differently, when allies fight together, who owns the victory? The nation that contributed more troops? The commander whose plan was followed? The force that took the objective first? The army that suffered greater casualties? The power that claims the better propaganda value? This isn't academic. This is the fundamental question of coalition warfare, and it has no good answer. The British perspective was that they'd been fighting since 1939, had bled in France and North Africa and the skies over Britain, had earned the right to senior leadership in combined operations. American forces were welcome allies, but they were also newcomers who needed to learn how war was actually fought. The British Empire's military tradition stretched back centuries. American mass production didn't automatically confer military wisdom. The American perspective was that British caution masked exhaustion, that the empire was clinging to faded glory while a new world order emerged. America's economic power was sustaining the alliance. American production was arming Soviet forces and British soldiers alike. Perhaps it was time for fresh thinking, aggressive action, and leadership that matched the scale of American contribution. Both perspectives had merit. Both were also poisoned by national pride that prioritized prestige over strategy. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The Allied victory in Sicily succeeded despite the command structure, not because of it. It succeeded because individual soldiers fought well, because logistical planning was sound, because the Axis defenders were overstretched and demoralized. But it failed strategically because ego overwhelmed operational sense. The Germans escaped from Sicily to defend Italy for another year and a half. The Peninsula Campaign, Salerno, Anzio, Monte Cassino, Gothic Line, would cost hundreds of thousands of Allied casualties. All that blood might have been saved if Allied commanders in Sicily had prioritized destroying enemy forces over racing each other to Messina. So who won Sicily? The official answer, the Allies. The actual answer, nobody. Or worse, the Germans who lost the island but saved their army. Think about that the next time you hear about Allied cooperation, or the special relationship, or coalition warfare. Think about how close it came to collapse over an island that both sides conquered. And ask yourself, if allies can't cooperate when they're winning, what hope is there for cooperation when things go badly? That question would haunt the alliance for the rest of the war. It haunts military coalitions to this day. The generals made the headlines. The soldiers paid the price. Private James Mitchell, 82nd Airborne, landed somewhere in southeastern Sicily. He was never sure exactly where. His stick of paratroopers scattered across miles of terrain. He spent July 11th walking alone through enemy territory, evading Italian patrols trying to find friendly forces. When he finally reached American lines 3 days later, his unit had been declared missing. Nobody had looked for him. Everyone was too busy advancing to worry about scattered paratroopers. Corporal David Hughes, British 8th Army, fought through 12 days of house-to-house combat approaching Catania. His platoon started with 32 men. By the time they secured the town, they numbered 14. The operational reports classified this as acceptable losses. Hughes's letters home, later found among his effects after he died in Normandy, described it differently: "We're spending lives like pocket change, and for what? So our general can say he took a town before the Americans took theirs." These men didn't care about the race to Messina. Didn't understand why American and British units were competing instead of cooperating. Couldn't comprehend how capturing an island somehow mattered less than capturing it first. What they understood was exhaustion. Fear. The specific weight of a dead friend. The way artillery sounds different when it's targeted at you versus when it's supporting you. The smell of a town that's been shelled for 3 days straight. The Sicily campaign lasted 38 days and cost roughly 24,000 Allied casualties. Killed, wounded, missing, captured. Break that down: about 630 casualties per day. About 26 per hour. About 1 Allied soldier dead or wounded every 2 minutes for more than a month straight. These weren't statistics to be traded for strategic objectives. They were sons, brothers, husbands, fathers. They were young men who'd volunteered to fight fascism, who believed in the cause, who trusted that their leaders would spend their lives wisely. And instead they were spent on ego. The Sicily campaign produced countless examples of soldiers caught between competing national interests, forced to execute orders that made no operational sense but perfect political sense. During Patton's drive on Palermo, American units advanced so quickly they outran their supply lines. Soldiers went days without hot food, without ammunition resupply, without medical support, because going slower would have meant arriving after the British reached their objectives. Men died from wounds that could have been treated if the advance had been timed to logistics instead of pride. During Montgomery's push toward Messina, British units conducted attacks they knew were futile, assaulting positions that would be outflanked by American advances within days, because standing still would have meant conceding momentum to Patton. Supply officers on both sides performed miracles of improvisation, scrounging, and creative logistics to support advances that happened faster than planning allowed. Then they watched those supplies get consumed in operations that achieved nothing except maintaining the pace of competition. Medical personnel set up field hospitals and then abandoned them days later as the advance continued, leaving wounded soldiers to be evacuated by following units, disrupting recovery because nobody wanted to be accused of slowing down the offensive. The soldiers understood, with the clarity that only comes from being close to death, that something had gone very wrong with the campaign. That they were fighting two enemies: the Germans in front of them and the institutional rivalry behind them. Private Thomas Riley, American infantry, wrote in his diary, "We took a hill today. Good position, overlooked the valley, would have been perfect for supporting the British attack tomorrow. Command ordered us to withdraw and advance north instead. The Brits will have to take that hill themselves now, lose men doing it. Why? Because sharing credit doesn't make headlines." Sergeant William Thompson, British artillery, recorded, "American unit called for fire support on coordinates in their sector. We had the angle, had the ammunition, could have helped. Our officer denied the request, said Americans should rely on their own batteries. 3 hours later we learned that American position was overrun. Don't know the casualties. Can't think about it. These weren't isolated incidents. The institutional files are full of examples, small, petty, lethal failures of cooperation that stemmed directly from the command-level dysfunction. And here's perhaps the most damning aspect: the soldiers still fought magnificently. Despite being betrayed by their commanders' egos, despite being thrown into a competition they didn't ask for and didn't benefit from, they performed with courage and skill and dedication. American forces fought their way across Sicily's toughest terrain. British forces broke German defensive positions that should have been impregnable. When the situations demanded it, when survival required cooperation, individual units worked together beautifully, proving that the dysfunction was at the top, not the bottom. The 82nd Airborne, despite being scattered across the island, regrouped and fought as cohesive units within days. The British 8th Army Infantry, despite being pushed harder than Montgomery's doctrine allowed, maintained discipline and effectiveness. American artillery supported British advances when local commanders ignored the institutional rivalry. British tanks covered American infantry when tactical reality demanded it. The soldiers saved the campaign. They succeeded despite their commanders, not because of them. And they remembered. Decades later, veterans of the Sicily campaign would speak carefully about their commanders, would describe the operations in language that emphasized the ground-level view. They never publicly blamed Patton or Montgomery for what happened. Military culture doesn't allow that kind of candor. But read their memoirs, their interview transcripts, their letters. The subtext is clear. We were betrayed by pride. We won despite our leaders. We paid the price for a victory that meant less than it should have because the men in charge cared more about beating each other than beating the enemy. That's the human cost of command dysfunction. Not just the casualties, though those were real and terrible, but the spiritual cost of discovering that the institution you serve, the cause you believed in, the alliance you trusted, was hollowed out by ego and nationalism. The soldiers conquered Sicily. But Sicily conquered something in them, the naive faith that being on the right side meant being led the right way. August 13, 1943. 3 days before Sicily falls. Both armies closing on Messina, the prize in sight. And then something happens that almost never makes it into official histories, that was suppressed at the time and minimized afterward. Allied forces nearly engaged each other in combat. The location was a crossroads town called Randazzo, in the foothills of Mount Etna. German rearguard forces had withdrawn the previous night. Both American and British patrols, advancing from different directions, reached the town simultaneously in the pre-dawn darkness. Nobody knew the other was there. Communications had broken down, or more accurately, had never been established, because neither command wanted to coordinate closely enough to risk the other side claiming the objective first. American scouts entered from the west. British scouts from the south. Both reported enemy movement in town. Both called for artillery support. And for approximately 15 minutes, a lifetime in combat, Allied artillery batteries prepared to fire on each other's positions. It didn't happen. A forward observer realized the enemy uniforms looked wrong, identified them as American, and called off the fire mission seconds before the guns fired. On the other side, a similar recognition prevented British artillery from destroying American positions. But it was close. Terrifyingly close. Official reports glossed over the incident. Described it as a coordination issue that was quickly resolved. Praised the observer's vigilance. Moved on to other topics. But everyone who was there understood. The alliance had nearly killed itself through competitive stupidity. This was the breaking point. Not a dramatic explosion, but a moment of clarity when everyone involved realized how close they'd come to catastrophe. Randazzo wasn't an isolated incident, it was just the closest call. Throughout the final week of the Sicily campaign, there were dozens of near misses. Allied aircraft nearly attacking Allied columns, Allied ships nearly firing on Allied landing craft, Allied units almost engaging each other in confused firefights. The Germans, defending their withdrawal with professional competence, were probably less dangerous to Allied forces than the Allies were to themselves. At headquarters, the staff officers who actually had to execute the competing directives from Patton and Montgomery began to simply ignore orders that would create dangerous situations. This was military insubordination at a systemic level, but it was also the only thing that prevented friendly fire disasters. A British logistics officer, in a classified memo that surfaced decades later, wrote, "We are now maintaining two separate intelligence pictures, two separate operational plans, two separate coordination mechanisms. One for fighting the Germans, one for managing the Americans. This is unsustainable and dangerous." An American operations officer responded to a directive from Patton's headquarters with a note that got him nearly court-martialed. "Sir, I cannot execute this order without creating conditions for Allied-on-Allied engagement. Respectfully request clarification of priorities. Are we trying to defeat the Germans or beat the British to Messina?" The question was never answered officially. But the officer wasn't disciplined either. Because everyone knew the answer and everyone knew it was shameful. Eisenhower, watching from Allied headquarters, saw his worst fears materializing. He'd spent months building an alliance structure, smoothing over national differences, creating mechanisms for cooperation. And in Sicily it was all collapsing. He couldn't publicly confront Patton or Montgomery, that would expose the dysfunction to the press, to the home fronts, to the enemy. He couldn't privately control them either. Both men were too powerful, too politically connected, too convinced of their own righteousness. So he did what institutional leaders do when direct confrontation fails. He documented everything. Every incident, every near miss, every failure of cooperation. Building a file that would justify future decisions. Planning for the day when he could remove or sideline commanders who couldn't work together. But in August 1943, that day hadn't come yet. The campaign still had to be finished. The victory still had to be secured. The alliance still had to hold together long enough to win the war. On August 17, the day after Messina fell, Eisenhower called a commanders' conference. Patton and Montgomery, Alexander and Tedder, senior staff from all services. Officially, it was a victory celebration and planning session for the Italian mainland campaign. Actually, it was an intervention. Eisenhower didn't lecture, didn't accuse, didn't point fingers. He was too skilled for that. Instead, he led them through an analysis of what had almost happened at Randazzo. Walked them through the communications failures, the coordination breakdowns, the near disaster. And then he asked a simple question. Gentlemen, if we can't fight the Germans without nearly shooting each other, how do we expect to invade Italy? How do we expect to invade France? How do we expect to win this war? The room was silent. These were men who commanded armies, who could reduce cities to rubble with a word, who shaped the fate of nations. And they had no answer. Because there was no answer. Except the obvious one: they had to change. The alliance had to become real instead of performative. The competition had to end before it killed them. Montgomery broke the silence first. He didn't apologize, that wasn't in his nature. But he acknowledged regrettable lapses in coordination, and committed to improved liaison procedures for future operations. Patton, for once, didn't counter with bravado. He was many things: arrogant, ambitious, theatrical, but he wasn't stupid. He'd seen how close they'd come to disaster. He nodded agreement. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't healing. It was barely even détente. But it was acknowledgement that the path they'd been on led to mutually assured destruction. The Sicily campaign was over. The race to Messina was won and lost simultaneously. And the alliance survived, barely damaged but intact enough to continue the war. But something had been broken that couldn't be fully repaired. A trust, a faith, an assumption that being on the same side meant actually working together. Everyone who lived through Sicily knew that the alliance was more fragile than propaganda admitted. That national pride was always one decision away from trumping strategic sense. That ego was always lurking, waiting to turn allies into rivals. The generals would work together for the rest of the war. Would plan D-Day and the liberation of Europe. Would coordinate the final defeat of Germany. Would stand together in victory photographs when it was all over. But they would never forget Sicily. Never forget how close they'd come to destroying each other while the real enemy escaped. Neither would the soldiers who'd fought there. Who'd watched their leaders race each other instead of winning smart. Who'd survived not just German bullets but Allied dysfunction. Sicily taught a lesson that no military academy includes in its curriculum. Sometimes the hardest enemy to defeat isn't the one shooting at you. It's the one standing beside you, wearing the same uniform but fighting a different war. The photographs tell you everything if you know how to read them. There's the official one. Patton and Montgomery in Messina, August 17, 1943. 2 generals, 2 flags, 1 captured city. Both men are smiling. Both are facing the cameras. Between them, nothing. No handshake, no gesture of shared triumph, no acknowledgement of common cause. Just empty space and forced grins. Compare it to the photographs of ordinary soldiers in the same city, same day. British and American troops together, arms around each other's shoulders, exhausted but genuine in their relief. They'd fought together when it mattered. They'd saved each other when tactical reality demanded it. They'd proven that cooperation was possible at the ground level. The problem was never with the alliance itself. It was with the men who claimed to lead it. Sicily was supposed to be proof of concept. That American and British forces could fight together as one coherent machine. That combined arms warfare across national lines could work. That the Grand Alliance could translate from diplomatic declaration to battlefield reality. Instead, it proved the opposite. It proved that national pride, personal ambition, and institutional rivalry could sabotage even the most carefully planned cooperation. That organizational charts and command structures couldn't overcome fundamental differences in military philosophy and culture. That having a common enemy wasn't enough if the people leading the fight couldn't stop competing with each other. The strategic illusion shattered in Sicily. The idea that the Allies were a unified force rather than a coalition of nations with overlapping but distinct interests. This matters more than it might seem. Because illusions, once broken, change how everyone behaves. After Sicily, Allied planning for future operations included something that hadn't been necessary before. Mechanisms to prevent command-level competition. D-Day planning would carefully delineate sectors to avoid operational overlap. The drive across France would include unprecedented levels of liaison officers and coordination protocols. The final push into Germany would be managed with almost paranoid attention to preventing inter-allied friction. In other words, the alliance learned from Sicily. But it learned by admitting that the commanders couldn't be trusted to cooperate naturally. That structures had to be imposed to force coordination that should have been automatic. At the highest levels, Roosevelt, Churchill, their senior advisors, Sicily prompted serious discussions about command changes. Should Patton be relieved? Should Montgomery be reined in? Should Alexander be replaced with someone who could actually control his subordinates? None of these changes happened because the political cost was too high. Patton was America's most visible general. Montgomery was Britain's hero. Removing either would be read as a national humiliation, would feed domestic criticism, would weaken the alliance publicly even if it strengthened it operationally. So instead, the dysfunction was managed. Patton was quietly sidelined for months after Sicily, officially for other reasons. Montgomery was kept on a tighter leash in Italy. Alexander was given more oversight and clearer directive authority. But the underlying problem, that Allied commanders might prioritize national prestige over strategic sense, was never solved. It was just contained, worked around, mitigated through process and procedure. The Germans understood what had happened. Intercepted communications, prisoner interrogations, and simple tactical observation made it clear that Allied commanders had been competing as much as cooperating. German after-action reports from Sicily noted command confusion and apparent lack of operational unity on the Allied side. Hitler reportedly remarked that the Allies would eventually lose the war to their own divisions, not meaning the military units but the political and institutional splits. He was wrong about the outcome but right about the vulnerability. The alliance held together, but it was always more fragile than appearances suggested. For the soldiers who fought in Sicily, the revelation was more personal and more painful. They'd believed in the righteousness of the cause. They trusted that their leaders were focused on winning, on defeating fascism, on ending the war as quickly as possible with minimum casualties. Sicily taught them otherwise. Taught them that wars are won by soldiers despite their commanders, not because of them. That institutional pride can be as dangerous as enemy fire. That being on the right side doesn't guarantee being led the right way. This revelation, this loss of institutional faith, doesn't get measured in after-action reports. Doesn't appear in casualty statistics. But it's real and it has consequences. Veterans of Sicily went on to fight in Italy, France, Germany. They fought well, won battles, contributed to victory. But they fought with a certain cynicism, a certain weathered skepticism about command decisions and strategic rationales. They'd seen behind the curtain. They'd watched the wizard operate the levers. They knew that military glory and national prestige sometimes mattered more to the leadership than the lives of the men doing the actual fighting. This wasn't universal desertion or mutiny. Military discipline held. The cause was still just. The enemy still needed to be defeated. But the naive faith was gone, replaced by professional competence stripped of illusion. Sicily also revealed something uncomfortable about democratic warfare. That even nations fighting for freedom and democracy could behave with imperial arrogance when it came to managing their alliance. Britain's attitude toward America often carried echoes of imperial condescension, the old power teaching the upstart colony how things are really done. America's attitude toward Britain often reflected dismissive impatience, the exhausted empire clinging to faded glory while vigorous youth takes charge. Neither perspective was entirely wrong. Neither was entirely right. Both were toxic to the cooperation they claimed to value. The island itself, Sicily, ended up being almost beside the point. It was conquered, occupied, eventually liberated and returned to Italian sovereignty. The Sicilian people who'd endured the campaign as unwilling hosts, resumed their lives. The strategic value of the island was realized. Mediterranean shipping secured, Italy invaded, Germany forced to defend another front. But the real revelation of Sicily wasn't about the island. It was about the alliance. About what happens when common cause meets competing pride. About how victory can coexist with strategic failure. About how close civilization's defenders can come to destroying each other while claiming to defend civilization. The lesson Sicily taught wasn't one anyone wanted to learn. That the greatest threat to the alliance wasn't always external. That the enemy within, the pride, the nationalism, the ego, could be as dangerous as the enemy across the front lines. This lesson would be tested again and again throughout the war. In Italy. In France. In the arguments over strategy, over resources, over credit. The alliance held, but Sicily proved it could have collapsed. That it survived was due more to the determination of soldiers and junior officers than to the wisdom of their commanders. And that's perhaps the most important revelation, that institutions succeed despite their leaders as often as because of them. That the alliance won not because its structure was perfect but because enough people at enough levels were committed to making it work even when their commanders seemed determined to tear it apart. Sicily, the victory that felt wrong. Because it was wrong. Because winning the island mattered less than maintaining the alliance, and the commanders chose the island. They got their headlines. They satisfied their pride. They secured their places in history. And they nearly lost the war in the process. There's a theorem in game theory called the tragedy of the commons. When multiple parties share a resource, individual self-interest can lead to collective ruin. Each party, acting rationally according to their own interests, makes decisions that are collectively irrational and destructive. Sicily was a tragedy of the commons played out in blood and ego. The shared resource was the alliance itself, the coalition that was supposed to defeat the Axis. Each commander, acting according to their national interests and personal ambitions, made decisions that nearly destroyed the very thing they needed to succeed. This isn't unique to Sicily or to World War II or even to military operations. It's a fundamental problem of human cooperation that appears wherever power must be shared. Consider every coalition government that falls apart over divisions between partners. Every corporate merger that fails because executives can't stop competing. Every partnership that dissolves because individual ambition overrides collective success. Every marriage that ends because neither person can stop keeping score. The pattern is always the same. Shared purpose brings people together. Competing for credit tears them apart. And the thing they were supposed to achieve suffers or fails entirely. What makes Sicily particularly instructive is that the stakes were existential. This wasn't about market share or political power. This was about defeating fascism. About ending a war that was consuming millions of lives. About defending civilization itself against totalitarian darkness. And even with stakes that high, ego nearly destroyed the alliance. If that doesn't tell you something fundamental about human nature, nothing will. The philosophical problem of shared power is that it requires surrendering the very thing that brings people to power in the first place. The conviction that their way is right, their judgment is sound, their leadership is essential. Effective leaders typically possess enormous self-confidence. That confidence is what allows them to make decisions under uncertainty, to take responsibility for consequences, to project the authority that makes people follow them. But that same confidence becomes toxic when power must be shared. Because confidence easily metastasizes into arrogance. Arrogance breeds contempt for other perspectives. And contempt makes cooperation impossible. Patton and Montgomery were both supremely confident commanders. That confidence had won battles, saved lives, advanced their nation's interests. But when forced to cooperate as equals, that confidence became the obstacle. Neither could accept that the other's way might be equally valid. Neither could subordinate their judgment to collective decision-making. The result? Strategic incoherence masquerading as parallel operations. Here's the deeper question. Could it have been different? Some historians argue that the personalities involved were the problem. That with different commanders, less prideful, more collaborative, more committed to the alliance over national glory, Sicily could have been the triumph of cooperation it was supposed to be. This is comforting but probably wrong. Because the commanders weren't operating in a vacuum. They were products and representatives of their nations, their military traditions, their cultural contexts. Britain in 1943 was an exhausted empire clinging to its remaining prestige. Its military confidence had been shattered by early defeats and rebuilt through painful victories. Its commanders had learned caution the hard way, through disasters from Dunkirk to Singapore. They weren't going to surrender leadership to upstart Americans who'd barely been in the war. America in 1943 was a rising superpower confident in its destiny, impatient with old-world caution, convinced that American methods, industrial, pragmatic, aggressive, represented the future. Its commanders weren't going to accept subordinate roles to a fading empire that had been fighting for 3 years without winning. These institutional pressures would have affected any commanders put in those positions. Different personalities might have handled the friction more gracefully, but the friction itself was structural, not personal. Which suggests that the problem of shared power might not have a solution, only management strategies that work better or worse. The alliance ultimately developed those strategies. The command structure for D-Day and the liberation of Europe was far more carefully designed than Sicily's. Sectors were clearly delineated. Chains of command were explicit. Coordination mechanisms were redundant and enforced. But note what this represents. Acknowledging that cooperation won't happen naturally, so it must be forced through structure. That's not solving the problem. That's building a cage around it. There's a darker interpretation of Sicily worth considering. Maybe the competition was inevitable. maybe even necessary. Maybe allied nations, with genuinely different strategic interests and perspectives, can only cooperate effectively when those differences are acknowledged rather than suppressed. The British wanted to avoid another Somme, another generation destroyed in frontal assaults. They'd seen what happened when commanders sacrificed soldiers carelessly. Their caution wasn't timidity, it was memory. The Americans wanted to win quickly and decisively, to bring overwhelming force to bear and end the war before it consumed another year of global suffering. Their aggression wasn't recklessness, it was urgency. Both perspectives had validity. The tension between them, between caution and aggression, between preservation and risk, might have actually produced better outcomes than either extreme alone. But that tension had to be managed at the strategic level, not fought out between competing commanders on the ground. Sicily's failure was allowing valid strategic debate to become toxic personal rivalry. The cost of shared power, then, is eternal vigilance against the slide from healthy tension to destructive competition. It requires leaders who can hold competing perspectives simultaneously, who can subordinate ego to collective success, who can accept that being part of a winning team matters more than being the star player. Such leaders exist, but they're rare. And they're especially rare in wartime, when the stakes reward aggressive confidence and punish collaborative doubt. Sicily reveals the tragedy. The very qualities that make someone an effective military commander, decisiveness, confidence, willingness to take risks, can make them a terrible coalition partner. The skills required to lead in combat are often opposed to the skills required to cooperate in complex alliances. This isn't a problem that gets solved. It's a tension that gets managed, sometimes well, sometimes badly. Sicily was an example of bad management. D-Day was an example of better management. But neither eliminated the underlying contradiction. The philosophical lesson, if there is one, is humbling. Humans are very good at identifying common enemies and very bad at working together against them. We can build alliances. We can coordinate actions. We can achieve shared objectives. But we do so despite our nature, not because of it. The impulse to compete, to claim credit, to prioritize individual or tribal success over collective achievement, that impulse is fundamental. It's older than civilization. It's written into our evolutionary history. It can be managed, channeled, sometimes overcome. But it never goes away. Sicily was a reminder of this uncomfortable truth. The Allies won because they had greater resources, better logistics, more resilient political systems, and yes, a more just cause. But they didn't win because cooperation came naturally or because shared power was easy. They won despite the difficulty of cooperation. Despite the toxicity of shared power. Despite the constant temptation to prioritize national glory over strategic sense. The victory in Sicily was real. But it was also a warning, that alliances are always fragile, that cooperation is always threatened by competition, and that the greatest challenge in warfare, maybe in all human endeavor, isn't defeating the enemy. It's not becoming one yourself. The last photograph in the Sicily file is dated September 8, 1943. Italy has surrendered. The campaign is officially over. Allied forces are preparing for the mainland invasion. The photograph shows an empty beach. No troops, no landing craft, no chaos of amphibious assault. Just sand and abandoned equipment and the debris that warfare leaves behind, shell casings, torn fabric, fragments of things that used to be important. The silence after victory is always strange. The noise stops. Guns, explosions, shouting, the continuous roar of warfare that becomes background after a while. And in that silence you notice things you'd stopped noticing. The way the Mediterranean looks in morning light. The smell of the sea without the chemical reek of explosives. The sound of wind without the percussion of artillery. For the soldiers who fought in Sicily, the silence brought exhaustion and relief and something harder to name. They'd won. They'd survived. They were moving on to the next campaign. But something felt unfinished, incomplete, wrong in a way that victory shouldn't feel. They'd seen their commanders wage two wars simultaneously, one against the Germans, one against each other. They'd watched the alliance they believed in reveal itself as something more fragile and political than they'd imagined. They'd conquered an island while learning that conquest wasn't the same as success. The institutional silence was even more profound. Allied headquarters produced reports on the Sicily campaign that praised the cooperation, celebrated the victory, analyzed the tactics and logistics with professional thoroughness. Lessons learned, best practices identified, recommendations for future operations. But nowhere in those official documents was an honest accounting of how close the alliance had come to self-destruction. Nowhere was acknowledgement that the race to Messina had sacrificed strategic objectives for personal glory. Nowhere was admission that the Germans had escaped largely because Allied commanders were more focused on beating each other than destroying the enemy. That silence was deliberate. Necessary, perhaps. The alliance had to continue. The war had to be won. Public acknowledgement of command dysfunction would have weakened morale, given comfort to the enemy, created political crises that could have fractured the coalition. So the truth was buried in classified files and personal diaries and the unspoken understanding of everyone who'd been there. The official history was written clean, triumphant, suitable for public consumption. The actual history lived in the margins, in the things that weren't said, in the gaps between official accounts and personal testimony. Patton and Montgomery never publicly reconciled. They worked together when necessary for the remainder of the war, maintained professional relationships, avoided open conflict. But privately, each remained convinced the other was the problem. Each wrote their own history, emphasizing their own achievements and minimizing the other's contributions. Their staffs, their subordinate commanders, their soldiers, they knew better. They'd seen the dysfunction up close. But military culture enforces silence about leadership failures. You don't contradict generals. You don't admit in official channels that command decisions were wrong. You salute, execute, and keep your opinions private until decades later when memoirs can be written and truths can be told. Sicily's legacy is complicated. Strategically, it achieved its objectives. Italy knocked out of the war, Mediterranean secured, Germans forced to defend another front. Tactically, it demonstrated that large-scale amphibious operations were feasible, crucial knowledge for D-Day planning. Operationally, it revealed the weaknesses in Allied command structure and forced improvements that strengthened future campaigns. But psychologically, spiritually, it damaged something important. It revealed that the alliance was transactional rather than transcendent. That national interest would always trump collective good when the pressure was high enough. That the men leading the fight were as vulnerable to pride and pettiness as anyone else. This revelation didn't destroy the alliance. But it changed it. Made it more cynical, more carefully managed, more dependent on structure than on faith. The coalition that emerged from Sicily was more effective operationally but less idealistic spiritually. Maybe that was necessary. Maybe mature alliances require disillusionment, require understanding that cooperation is work, not magic. That unity has to be built consciously against the constant pull of division. Or maybe Sicily was a warning that was never fully heeded. That alliances remain vulnerable to the same human weaknesses that threatened them in 1943. That ego and nationalism and competitive pride are always waiting to fracture cooperation when the stakes get high enough. The soldiers who fought in Sicily carried their experiences through the rest of the war and into the peace that followed. Most didn't talk about it much. War stories tend to be about dramatic moments, the assault under fire, the narrow escape, the buddy who didn't make it. Less often about the slow realization that the institution you serve is flawed, that the leaders you follow are fallible, that victory can coexist with strategic failure. But that knowledge changed them. Made them less trustful of official narratives. Less willing to accept that being on the right side meant being led the right way. Less naive about the difference between propaganda and reality. Decades later, in interviews and memoirs, they'd talk about Sicily with a certain weariness. Yes, it was a victory. Yes, they were proud of their service. But there was always a but in those conversations. A sense that something had been lost even as the island was won. The last veterans of Sicily are dying now. Within a few years, there will be no one left who remembers firsthand what happened there in the summer of 1943. The official history will be all that remains. The sanitized version, the triumph of Allied arms, the successful cooperation. And maybe that's how it should be. Maybe the painful truths about institutional dysfunction and command rivalry serve their purpose by informing future planning, and then can be allowed to fade. But maybe not. Maybe each generation needs to learn again that alliances are fragile, that cooperation is hard, that shared power amplifies human weaknesses as much as it combines human strengths. Maybe Sicily's lessons remain relevant precisely because they're uncomfortable. The silence after victory is always temporary. New conflicts emerge. New alliances form. New commanders make new decisions. The cycle continues, humans being humans, nations being nations, power being power. But the silence after Sicily carries a specific warning across the decades. When you defeat your enemy but nearly destroy your alliance in the process, what exactly have you won? The official answer remains, Sicily. An island. A strategic position. A necessary step toward final victory. The actual answer remains more complicated, more troubled, more relevant. You've won the battle and revealed the fragility of your coalition. You've succeeded tactically while failing strategically. You've demonstrated both the power and the weakness of alliance warfare. And in doing so, you've taught a lesson that every future coalition needs to learn but hopes it won't have to, that sometimes the hardest enemy to defeat isn't the one shooting at you. It's the impulse to compete with the ally standing beside you, fighting the same war, supposedly pursuing the same objective. That lesson echoes in the silence after every victory, especially the ones that felt wrong. Especially Sicily.